Achieving depth was really the exciting challenge and opportunity of this scene. I'm out at an overlook, looking out over some vineyards in Pleasant Valley and Aptos, and it's a beautiful, clear morning in December. From this vantage point over the vineyards, I'm looking down over flat areas like roads and vineyards and meadows that are punctuated by tall vertical shapes like trees and the silhouette of hills. I want to create an illusion of this three-dimensional space on my paper. First thing I need to do is in my drawing, I need to make sure that it has really good linear perspective. If I were making this scene up in my head, I'd have to think a lot harder about linear perspective. I'd have to draw out a horizon line and put a grid down and place all of the trees and vineyards onto it. But because this is a real scene that is already arranged in perspective for me by virtue of just being a human that can look at it, I'm actually not going to think in terms of linear perspective at all. Instead, I'm looking at the scene as if it's a jigsaw puzzle, flat in front of my face. Each formless blob of green oak trees and yellow sections of grapevines become a piece of that puzzle. When I'm drawing, I'm essentially documenting the position, shape, and size of each piece. I'm trusting that if I document each puzzle piece correctly, the viewer will recognize the linear perspective innate in the scene. Now that I'm happy with my drawing, I'm going to switch to thinking in terms of atmospheric perspective to achieve depth. According to atmospheric perspective, what is farther away is more pale, more blue, and lower contrast. To get myself into that mode, I put a light phthalo blue wash over the whole paper. That phthalo blue defines the shade of the sky and sets the baseline on which every other shade will be compared. Because next, I laid down a slightly darker blue-gray for the farthest hill, then a slightly darker blue-gray for the next farthest hill. Now I'm getting close enough so that the range of color is extending outside of blue and gray. So I've put down onto my palette sap green, viridian green, Indian yellow, and magenta. As I work forward, I'm going to incorporate more and more of these colors into my mixes of shades of blue. But also, as I'm working forward, I'm not only diversifying the colors, but also the range of values. Values meaning the range between very light and very dark. Every time I move forward in the scene, the darkest dark becomes darker, to the point that when I finally get to the tree in the foreground, I'll get to use true black in its darkest shadows. Mixing color is never an exact science, but especially so when you're painting with gouache, because it's notorious for drying darker than it appears wet. Inevitably, I'll have to go back and tweak values once they dry, but I'm really trying to get it right on the first stroke. I want the brush strokes on this faraway area to be as simple and elegant as possible. Representing a single tree in one or two brush strokes mimics the way that our eyes simplify faraway shapes, and it will add to the illusion of depth. This scene is backlit, meaning the sun is oriented behind all the shapes that I'm painting. This gives a lot of the shapes a sort of sparkly halo, which I love. And I'm using a very thin brush loaded with almost pure white to drop some sparkles around the edge of the trees and buildings in the distance. This is when it is really, really paying off to have gotten the drawing more or less correct before I started putting paint down. Because I know that the drawing is correct, I'm able to make these really bold, expressive brushstrokes and keep them. Later, I won't realize that, oh, that tree's in the wrong place and it makes the perspective all wonky, and I have to break up or paint over this brushstroke that I previously fell in love with. And it's just every time when I spend a lot of time getting the drawing right on a complicated scene, it always pays off. So this is around the time when I found out that we were gonna have to pack up and leave soon. I was actually crashing a paint out with the Santa Cruz oil painters. They've been really generously letting me join, even though I'm not an oil painter and I'm also not a member. And they've got access to amazing spots like this vantage point, which is on the property of the friend of one of the members. So I found out we had to pack up to leave, and I didn't do what I had planned to do, which was to incorporate some warmer paints like burnt sienna into my color mixes in the foreground. By incorporating new shades of paint only in the foreground, that's going to naturally create that warmer color palette in the foreground as compared to the cooler color palette in the background, and therefore increasing atmospheric depth. But because I was suddenly rushed, I completely forgot about that, and I became determined to use up all of the paint left on my palette. And so the foreground ended up much cooler than I had originally planned. But luckily, I have no pride, and I decided to fix that at home. You can see right off the bat, I'm trying to get into a new color headspace and dropping in some really bold mixes of burnt sienna with, some other stuff like blues and grays, and dropping it into the foreground. I'm trying to reorient my entire sense of color in this new space of the painting that's going to be overall much warmer. Now, I also realized that even taking atmospheric perspective into account, this painting is still very much shifted blue. So I am still going to have some very cool blue shadows in the foreground, even as I warm up the bright spots. Remember in the beginning when I did that light wash of almost pure phthalo blue over the whole paper? I find that pretty much any time I do a wash like that, it just programs my mind to have the entire painting shifted toward that color. A lot of people amazingly will do a wash that's complementary to the final tint of the painting. So like if they want to do a lot of blues, they'll do like a beautiful orange wash and then they paint blues over it, and it makes this really vibrant painting. Someday I'll learn how to do that, but for now, when I put a wash down, that's gonna be the final tint of the painting, and I'm okay with that. I think that the overall blue shift of this piece really captures this cool December day that it was. And I think that even within that blue shift, the foreground is warmed up enough so that it all looks like one scene and we get that real sense of depth.